Good evening, and thank you all for coming to this event and this book discussion about American foundations and higher education development in Africa. We will be discussing the themes of Fabrice Jaumont's exciting new book, Unequal Partners. Thank you also to Albertine Books for hosting us this evening. My name is Naomi Moland. I'm an adjunct assistant professor in international and comparative education at Teachers College, Columbia University, and also a postdoctoral research fellow at New York University. At a time when higher education is once again recognized as a driver of development and income growth, and when knowledge economies requiring additional levels of education are displacing economies that are predicated on manufacturing, issues of higher education development are at the forefront. However, we are also at a time when higher education itself appears increasingly precarious and under dramatic pressures to adapt to new conditions. In this context, we need to ask what the role of global philanthropy can or should be in developing higher education. Fabrice Jaumont and Teboho Moja will discuss how new philanthropic trends are emerging from this historical context, and will examine the conditions under which philanthropy can be effective, the impasses that foundations often face, and the updated contexts in which philanthropy operates today. Teboho Moja is a professor of higher education at New York University. She has authored articles on higher education reform issues in areas such as the governance of higher education, policy processes, and the impact of globalization on higher education. She is the co-author of a book on educational change in South Africa since the first democratic elections in 1994. Her teaching experience includes high school and university levels. Moja has held several key positions at several South African universities, including being appointed chair of the board of trustees to the largest university in South Africa, the University of South Africa. In 2010, she was appointed visiting professor at the University of Oslo in Norway and the University of Tampere in Finland. She was instrumental in setting up the Center for Higher Education Transformation, CHET, in South Africa to monitor and stimulate debates on change issues. Moja also serves on the boards of international bodies such as the UNESCO Institute for International Education Planning and World Education Markets. Her course topics include current research in higher education, international perspectives on reform, and globalization in higher education. She has also been a policy researcher and a policy analyst for higher education in South Africa. Moja was appointed the executive director and commissioner to the National Commission on Higher Education in South Africa, appointed by President Mandela. This commission produced a national report that provided a framework for higher education reform in South Africa. And before coming to NYU, Teboho Moja served as a special advisor to the Minister of Education. And Fabrice Jaumont is the author of Unequal Partners, American Foundations and Higher Education Development in Africa, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2006. His upcoming book, The Bilingual Revolution, 2016, very fresh off the press. His upcoming book, The Bilingual Revolution, which will be published by Multilingual Matters in 2017, focuses on the development of dual language and immersion programs in public schools in the United States. Jaumont holds a PhD in international education from New York University. His research finds itself at the intersection of comparative and international education, cultural and linguistic preservation, philanthropy, cultural diplomacy, and international development. He currently serves as the program officer for the French-American Cultural Exchange, the FACE Foundation, in New York, and as the education attaché for the Embassy of France to the United States. Fabrice Jaumont has written a book that needed to be written decades ago. Unequal Partners, American Foundations and Higher Education Development in Africa, tells the complicated story of how philanthropy has shaped higher education in both positive and negative ways. Although the great philanthropists have always been lauded in many books for decades, recent scholarship has challenged their benevolence and that of their foundations. Jaumont provides a fair portrayal of major foundation players in African higher education, those with a long track record and those who have just started to play a role. Rather than present these foundations as saviors that uplift higher education on the continent, Jaumont presents a nuanced view, detailing the profound impact as well as the unequal relationships that result when one of the partners has more resources and the other is in need of resources. The discussions and themes featured in this book are useful to those studying and working with foundations in the US as well as in Africa. Interestingly, many of the interventions in Africa are very similar to those used in urban and minority communities in the United States. Overall, Unequal Partners is beautifully written, succinctly and effectively argued, and timely. So we're going to move into some discussion with Dr. Moja and Dr. Jaumont. And so Fabrice, I'm also going to make it less formal and call you Fabrice. So Fabrice, to start off, can you tell us a little bit about why and how you wrote the book?
Yes, sure. Before I start, I want to thank everyone for coming on a beautiful day in New York. It's been raining for 3 days, so I appreciate that you're here braving the element. But I wanted to write this book for a simple reason, really. As a Frenchman coming from France, where education and many other topics are still controlled by the state or decided by the state, in the US, I was intrigued to see so many philanthropists and foundations trying to change things, trying to improve the life of children, of schools and communities, trying to tackle big issues and smaller ones as well. This was an intriguing thing for me. I benefited from philanthropists in my work here at the French Embassy. We constantly raise funds for bilingual programs or cultural programs, and we couldn't do it without philanthropists and without foundations. So when I started doing my research, I thought, why not focus on foundations and philanthropy? And I was lucky enough to meet people who had worked in development, who had worked with higher education in Africa, and who had benefited from foundations. So that gave me a big topic to examine. And when I was at NYU, I was fortunate to meet people who worked at the Partnership for Higher Education in Africa, and these were top foundations. You had the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Ford Foundation, MacArthur Foundation, Hewlett, Rockefeller, the big names. And they were all trying to do one thing. They were all trying to transform higher education in Africa. And I thought, wow, this is an opportunity for me to delve into this mysterious world of international foundations trying to transform an entire field such as higher education in Africa. So that's how I got to write this book.
Excellent, thank you. And Teboho, just to give us a little bit broader context for what Fabrice is talking about, can you tell us about the state of higher education in Africa? What are some of the changes and challenges?
Okay, thank you. And I join Fabrice in thanking you for being here. So I know on a day like this, it means we are really interested in what we are sharing with you tonight. Okay, so the state of higher education. I think if you asked me that question or asked anybody else that question about 2 decades ago, the kind of answer you'd get is a grim picture of the challenges and the negative things that are happening with higher education in Africa. And at this point in time, I would say that the trend has changed. We are looking at a different picture when we look at higher education in Africa, and I would say that we have a good story to tell compared with the grim picture that used to be painted about higher education in Africa. I'm saying that because when we look at what is happening in general in Africa, one would say that the discourse of talking about higher education in Africa as being exceptional in nature, in the role that it is playing in society, in contributing less to development, in having lower rates of return and all that has actually changed. I mean, we have seen changes implemented, spearheaded by the World Bank and other development agencies that have now seen Africa and higher education in Africa as playing the same role as it does throughout the world. And when we look at that, I would say that it is not just coming from a change of heart from the development agencies or from the philanthropists per se, but it is because of what the African leadership is also doing and the role that it is playing. And examples of that for me that I would share with you is just looking at the African Union and the current strategic visions that are putting forward about what the role of higher education in Africa should be. There's this, the development plan called the Development Plan 2063, which to some extent I don't agree with anybody setting a plan that outlives them because they're not going to be there to see, make sure that the goals are achieved or so. But what it contains is really positive, pushing higher education in Africa into the center of development, just like all other regions where we know that higher education plays a major role in development. Last year, another example is the summit that was held in Dhaka that was looking at revitalizing higher education for higher education to contribute to development. And those are the kind of positive messages that have been on the go for a long time until development agencies realize that there's no exceptionalism about Africa and what would spear its development or so. So we have that strategic vision. And if we look at what has happened over a period of time in Africa, taking as an example just the massive growth of higher education systems, the expansion of participation rates and all that are happening in Africa, one can see that positive message coming through. I was looking at some of the data recently, looking at where we were going back to as far back as 1944, where Africa as a continent only had 31 institutions of higher learning, particularly universities. And in 2015, that number had increased to 1,639. That's a massive growth. That's something like 74% growth. And when you compare that with the other regions, you can see that Africa experienced the biggest growth. That's in terms of the number of institutions, as well as the number of participants, people who are accessing higher education, who are going into higher education. And I would give benefit also to philanthropists that part of those developments didn't happen with the institutions in Africa working on their own, but a little bit of the contribution that has come from the philanthropy world has also contributed. Initiatives that have pushed for opening up access for certain categories of people, for revitalizing even activities that were taking place in Africa when people were feeling really demoralized, feeling low, and getting a little bit of money to really take some steps forward, implement new initiatives, and really encourage some goals or so. This has put a lot of demand on opening up access with the kind of demand that people are making to accessing higher education. So another trend that we see that has really tried to help in meeting the demand for growth and expansion has been the growth in the number of private institutions. And again, the private institutions have been set up and established because of money from donor agencies and other development agencies too that have played a role. So Africa's agenda has been to expand access into higher education, to have more people, because we all buy the whole ideology that a lively and a vibrant higher education system will contribute to development. So I would say in a nutshell, that's where we are. There's a vision there, and there is evidence that we are moving towards that vision. The last point I want to mention also is that looking at the state of higher education in Africa, we are struggling a lot in terms of our rates of knowledge production. We know that lots of research and knowledge production is happening outside of Africa, and in Africa we are the consumers of that knowledge that's being produced. At the moment, there's a big interest in looking at how some of the universities, I know not all, of course, some of the universities can actually move forward and become major players in knowledge production, even if it's knowledge that's just relevant within the African context or so. So another discourse that has happened is looking at those pessimistic sort of perspectives that have always said that it is impossible to have world-class universities in Africa, world-class universities that will produce knowledge or so, to looking at how some of the African universities can strategically position themselves to become research universities. And I've just come back from South Africa now, where we had a meeting of about 8 universities or so that have been part of a project funded by Carnegie mainly, that are examining themselves and looking at strategies as to how they can position themselves to become research-intensive universities. They might not be at the top of the rankings or make it into the world rankings, but what they will be doing within the continent is to intensify knowledge production per se. So that's just some of the examples I wanted to mention.
Great, thank you. And building off the example that you just gave of the Carnegie Corporation or Foundation working to develop research particularly, Fabrice, can you talk more about the roles of foundations and American philanthropy more broadly? What are the ways that they contribute to African universities and also to society in general?
Sure, yeah. Well, it is a formidable community of American foundations. I just checked recently the data from the Foundation Center, and we have now 87,000 foundations in the United States. Just that number is mind-boggling, but altogether they represent over $800 billion in assets. And each year they give out $60 billion to various numbers of topics, of course, but education is number one on the list of topics being supported. All of these foundations, for the most part, are private foundations, independent foundations. You know the most famous ones, I'm sure, whether it's the Bill Gates Foundation or the Ford Foundations, but there are family foundations of all sizes, and they choose what they want to support, where they want to support, how they want to support. They are free to determine this kind of work that they want to support. And it is in Africa particularly interesting to see more and more American foundations getting involved. Over 300 international foundations, they're called international when they start funding outside of the US, are now investing in Africa and in Africa's development. If you click on the slide here, I have a small camembert, as we say in French, which shows where and which are the topics that are supported by American foundations in particular. This was a survey that I did over 10 years, and the focus of foundations were primarily in human rights, education, secondary education, youth, development, and that includes economic development, health, and higher education. So this gives you an idea. All in all, this represented about $4 billion over the course of 10 years between 2003 and 2013. And it is interesting to see higher education and secondary education being the number one here on the list of priorities. And foundations, also, if you could show the second slide, then they tend to invest in mostly English-speaking countries and in English-speaking institutions. The second slide here shows you that basically there's very little done in French-speaking countries, and I know it's a big topic here for us at the French Embassy. But throughout the Francophone world, you see that there's a definite lack of, maybe not lack of interest, but lack of connection between French-speaking institutions and American philanthropies. And if you look at the next slide, I'll show you a map which shows where exactly American foundations tend to work. You can see that, strangely enough, this follows old colonial lines, former Commonwealth countries, and we're definitely talking of different blocks here of knowledge production, of influencers and institutions benefiting from international donors. This can be a problem if you think of the future of higher education in Africa, if it's only going to be done in English, or if there are other options for non-English speaking institutions. But if we could move on to the next slide. Some of the top donors, I hope you can see those big names. Number one, obviously, particularly for health and, well, Gates is out of that table, but Gates is so big that it crushes everybody else. And the domination of the Gates Foundation in health in particular is so vast that it's almost unfair to compare it with other foundations. But in higher education in particular, and this chart talks about higher education, the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, Mellon Foundation, Carnegie Foundation, Kellogg, and you see MacArthur, all these names that are very familiar to the United States are very active in transforming universities in Africa. Now, that funding seems to be going only to a specific set of universities, and that's the next slide. Another finding was that only a few universities were getting all the money, basically. A lot of them in South Africa, actually. So I guess South African universities know how to play the game of foundation talk and how to raise funds from American foundations. So here you see the universities that are listed. University of Cape Town, which is definitely winning all the awards, and a number of the other universities are South African universities. You see Makerere University in Uganda, the University of Ghana. But again, hard to find a Francophone or a Portuguese-speaking institution. There are a few there, but they're only getting leftovers or whatever peanuts that are left. So that's an overview of maybe the last one. That's an overview of where foundations tend to fund and invest in higher education in Africa, and these are the various topics that are being funded. Number one being capacity building, and this is a big term being used by those international foundations. Sometimes it's actually confusing to understand what capacity building means because it's used all the time for so many different things. But definitely building capacity, transforming universities, constructing buildings and libraries, research centers on campuses, that is where most of the money is going. It is followed by what I call here branches of knowledge and knowledge production, which Teboho was talking about. Followed also by access, creating access for women, for instance, that can now get their masters or their PhD. So creating access for minorities so that they can gain the useful skills to succeed. So these are the various topics that are now top priorities for international foundations. I think I can stop here.
Okay, great. Thank you. So with all of these foundations, this has been a great summary for us to see where they're working the most and what areas within universities they're working the most. Teboho, can you tell us about what are the obstacles that these foundations might face in higher education and other sectors in Africa? Some of the challenges.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think just the title of Fabrice's book sort of answers that. You are dealing with unequal partners. And that in itself poses a number of challenges also. So first, it's a historical challenge, and Fabrice has already touched on that. The money follows the colonial path. So you see where the foundations are putting their money, and that in itself is an obstacle that's embedded in the establishment documents for those particular foundations or so. It is not the program officers or the sort of presidents of organizations or of those foundations that decide which countries are going to operate in, but the founding papers actually spell the places where they could operate, spells out the kind of areas that they can focus on, and that creates problems. It creates problems of a mismatch between the priorities that the philanthropists are working with and the priorities of the recipients on the other side, the grantees or so. So there is often tension between what is seen as a priority for Africa's development agenda, restricted by the foundations of the philanthropy, bodies, and the development agenda that are spelled out by the people on the ground that know exactly what it is that they need or so. And if you enter a relationship where one comes with a checkbook and you don't have a checkbook, you are more likely to go and dine where the checkbook holder is suggesting would be the best place to dine. So I find that just the nature of the relationship in itself poses some kind of obstacles because the recipients have to sort of adapt their priorities, change their priorities to align them with the priorities that have been set on the other side of the world or so. So I have found that to be one of the major, major challenges. A lot still gets achieved because if the recipients adapt their own priorities, they might take priority number 10 and put it at the top. There's still some gain out of that, but it's not necessarily the path that they would have followed. And yeah, so that's one of those challenges that I see and the major obstacle. And I'm sure Fabrice has more to say about that.
Yeah, no, I think this is definitely the main issue, and the consequence of that issue is about ownership. Who owns the development agenda, and if you don't own it, then then the question is whether you're being pushed towards different models. People look at foundations sometimes with a hegemonic lens and say, well, this is westernization of universities, westernization of Africa, and I wonder if we should perhaps not think with such extreme terms, but there is a definite debate about what is an African model of higher education. Is there one, for instance, and can it be accepted by international donors, or should we just forget about an African model? And is our African universities going to become or follow the American style of higher education? Is Makerere University going to be the next NYU of Africa, for instance?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting debate that is emerging and playing itself out a lot in South Africa at the current moment, where students have been on big protests and all, demanding the decolonization of higher education, the curriculum and all. But this is not a new debate on the African continent. South Africa is sort of going through this as one of the last countries to really gain their freedom to some extent. But going back to the 60s, when the African states gained their independence or so, one of the first things that they really questioned was, what is an African university and what role can an African university play in development within the African continent or so? Is it a Western sort of construct that's transplanted onto the African soil, or is there an African university? That remains an unresolved issue. But despite all that, Africans know what they want, how they can go forward, and they are not different from the rest of the world, as I said, right from the beginning or so. Africans know what is best for them, and an example of that is the leadership that we have had within the continent, particularly under somebody like President Thabo Mbeki, who came from South Africa while he was the president in South Africa, and together with the president in Senegal and others designated by the African Union to spearhead Africa's development agenda. And they came up with NEPAD. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. What does NEPAD stand for? New Partnership in Africa's Development. And the main essence of NEPAD was to say, let us determine our priorities, let us determine our development needs, our development path, and you can join the partnership on our terms, because we should remember this whole world of philanthropy is a co-dependent kind of relationship. The check holder is looking for somebody to receive the check. So it's not just a matter of the recipient chasing after the money and wanting the money. It's a co-dependent relationship. So in this NEPAD, new partnership in Africa's development, what the African leadership was saying was, give us chance first to step back, determine our agenda, then let's meet each other halfway on our terms, on your terms, and in a negotiated relationship, we can work hand in hand to contribute to Africa's development.
If you could show the last slide, please, Naomi, because it's a quote from a vice chancellor. Vice chancellors are university presidents, and this is reflective of what we were discussing. This person is asking, is it a partnership of foundations, or is it a partnership between foundations and African universities? How are we involved in defining the agenda and so forth? And this is this has come back many times through the interviews that I did for the book. Scholars, African scholars, or university presidents are always asking these questions: can they be treated as equal, and should they follow everything that the foundations are asking? I know for some of the foundations like Carnegie Corporation, there was a big focus on gender studies, for instance, and the development of gender studies in African universities. But for some presidents, this was not the priority. They thought getting access to the internet was more important, or turning on the lights sometimes. And so where should we follow what a funder says, and where should we stand our ground?
We've hit on a lot of interesting themes here. I'd like to open it up to the audience for further questions. I have a lot more questions as well, but I'm sure that you do. Either for Fabrice or Teboho, would anyone like to start us off?
There's a mic in the back as well.
Yeah. There's one over here, I think, and then Andrew. Sorry, just. Go ahead. Well, we'll pass the mic up to you after she goes, so we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm not sure if you touched on this, but what is the role of the diaspora in supporting African-based universities, or supporting the agenda, the priorities? What are your thoughts?
Well, the African Union takes the diaspora very serious, sees the diaspora as another region of Africa. And I would say one of the foundations that is also taking that seriously within higher education is Carnegie Corporation. As you might be aware that there's the Carnegie program that's supporting the African diaspora to actually spend time in Africa and make a contribution there, with a particular focus on supporting research, supporting curriculum development, and assisting in the supervision of graduate students or so. And with Carnegie's money and this whole CADPF, it's called, we are looking, and I say we because I serve on the advisory board for that, we are looking at other foundations to come on board and join, and we have been taking initiatives to push that. And for me, that's an example of where Africa determines its needs and then comes forward to say, here we are, can you come on board, and we work together towards contributing to development. I think that supporting the diaspora is something of a discourse for the foundations. It's not something that they have done in the past and work in that area. So they've been challenged to start looking at not necessarily making grants onto in Africa and giving institutions money to say these are the priorities that you should be focusing on, but rather saying we can support the diaspora to be part of that development agenda. So we are making some progress to some extent, and I'm hoping that with the model that is being developed at the moment with Carnegie support, we will see more philanthropists supporting the diaspora to contribute. And there's one strand of it that we haven't spent much time focusing on, but that I've been thinking about, is that development doesn't just depend on what's going on within the universities alone, but if there's support of the diaspora to go work with the universities, there should be an element of it that goes into the communities and working with organizations in the communities too, rather than setting parallel sort of structures. But people shouldn't be seeing themselves as just contributing to the universities, but broaden the scope a little bit.
I'd like to add that there is also an interesting growth in philanthropists from the diaspora. The diaspora is definitely producing wealth, and more philanthropists are now coming out of the diaspora. And there's also an interesting growth in Africa-based foundations, the foundations that are created and that actually exist, grow in Africa, and support and start to play a role. And that's important in terms of who decides the agenda for development. It is probably better to see players on the continent being actively engaged, and that's the good news. Basically, there's growth in higher education, and there's growth in philanthropy, in African philanthropy as well.
I'm not sure how to use this, but I was wondering if there were more foundations that were francophone, would they help countries in Africa that are francophone? I don't know if anybody has touched on this. It's something that is always on my mind. Obviously, I don't come from France, or I do come from a colonized country, Ireland, so it's been our problem too.
There's a lot of public funding coming from French-speaking countries. There's a lot of private money coming from, let's say, countries which probably will have more of a philanthropic tradition, and I'm thinking about Canada in particular.
Yeah, sure.
A lot of Canadian foundations are investing in African higher education and secondary education as well. From a French perspective, although there is a growing network of foundations in France, it is still not something that people talk about or are informed about. Whereas foundations are investing, French foundations will be investing in universities in Senegal or in Mali. You definitely see a more traditional aid coming from development agencies in those regions, although this is shrinking year after year, budget cuts and so forth. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good. We have a couple more questions over here in the back. All right. Yeah. There we go.
Okay, thank you. I will ask my question, then I will have to run to catch a bus. Wonderful opportunity here to discuss very, very important issues. I have several questions, but I will maybe limit to one. The political dimension and the role, as Professor Moja mentioned earlier, the development university. When African countries were thinking at that time of elevating the entire continent, and you cannot do it properly if you follow these borders that were created not by Africans but by others. And some of the current challenges, Boko Haram and all that, are telling the story that these borders don't matter in terms of what is real. What are the development goals and how those goals can be achieved? It will not be necessarily within each border drawn by the Europeans. So if you could address two dimensions of that. One is sustainability of these policies. When African countries, through the African Union and before that, are thinking of how do we get ahead together, what are the plans? And then there is this interruption, although it has positive aspect, that tells them that you have to follow this. Two in West Africa, the pet countries, Ghana in West Africa always win, and the Makerere and so on and so forth. So this is one dimension of that issue. And for the French, who also are so eager to keep their grip on African countries they colonized. What are they thinking? I don't mean to embarrass you or anything, but you should be in a position to tell us. If the countries you want to control are staying behind as a result of lack of certain resources, even if those resources are not necessarily where the African would like to put them, but they serve some, they use them for something. So what are they thinking? What is the thinking? When France itself is part of the European Union, thinking globally, and yet at the same time still thinking in terms of how to have the France-Afrique, they just finished the meeting in Madagascar.
Yeah. And then Indri asks them and runs away, so she doesn't, she won't know what we said about that. No, that's fine. No, I think we might not necessarily be the ones who have the answers, but it's more of raising the issues that we are aware of and how they're being addressed. I think with the political divide that you're raising, Indri, is relating to this kind of divisions and the challenges that the continent is facing. We should still keep in mind the colonial history that has really led to those kind of problems or so. And the fact that Africa as a continent is so big, and time and again we treat it as being homogeneous, despite the African leadership and the Africans themselves redividing it in a different way, the regions, the way we work with the different divisions, because we cannot work with the whole continent as being homogeneous or so. And there are positive outcomes or trends that we can observe, looking at some of the initiatives of the African Union, setting up the African Union University and basing it on regions rather than on the colonial boundaries, where expertise is centers of excellence based on regions and trying to serve regions irrespective of who colonized who, when, and how, or so. So there are trends that indicate ways to move forward in a way that we can sort of dismantle our colonial history or so. So I think there are some things happening.
Yeah, hard for me to talk about the position of France on these issues, although there's a French flag behind us. But there's definitely a growing interest for all involved. When I look at, and I look only at American foundations and the millions invested, the goal for these foundations was to change and transform the entire continent, not just certain countries that belonged or used to belong to the Commonwealth. So, although you can still find colonial lines based on the number of connections they built, the historical ties between foundations and universities, the ambition of those philanthropists were definitely to transform all of Africa, all of higher education in Africa. And in one of their reports, a report of the Partnership for Higher Education, after 10 years of investment, they claim to have, changed the life of 4 million students in Africa. And I was puzzled by this claims. How can you do this by just working in 40 universities? But in their mind, if you manage to transform 40 universities in, let's say, 9 countries, you still influence the entire sector and transform the entire continent. So it's a way of answering to that question about colonial lines. They're not necessarily in the minds of foundations in this country, in America.
There's another question in the back.
I think my question has been answered by the question you raised, but I was really encouraged to hear you mentioned the centers of excellence that are emerging. And I spent 7 years working in the philanthropic space for one of the big foundations, and there's evidence that homegrown solutions are taking hold. I think one of my biggest frustration is that the linking and the sharing of knowledge is not happening at the pace with which technology enables us to share knowledge. And you mentioned NEPAD and AU and those efforts. They're amazing. But what else can we do to accelerate this? Because the knowledge is there, the capabilities there, the innovations there, the goodwill is there, and the resources are there. I mean, even you mentioned, African philanthropists, the Tony Lumulus, the Dangotes. I mean, they're all investing in this space. What do we do to accelerate this?
You want me to go? Yeah. I think changing perspectives on the role of higher education, that's something that came in a lot of interviews that I did of program officers or foundation presidents, and they came in at a time where higher education was not important. It was not a priority. A lot of the funding, the international donors, would focus on the primary education in Africa, and that was it. But they came in at a time, and this was early 2000. They came in at a time with a vision for higher education, and they thought that they could change that perspective and make everybody else change their perspective on higher education in Africa, and transfer and see universities as engines of development, which is a completely different way to look at higher education. That's one thing. This should continue. This should not stop. This is something that I worry about, is that those foundations tried something for a number of years and then suddenly stop doing it and hope that it will be picked up by bigger funders, for instance, and I hope it will.
Good. Other questions? Go ahead. Yeah.
A pretty complex theme. So we talk about the, I don't want to say the collision, but the struggle between the identity of Africa versus the influence of Western former colonials. What isn't talked about much is the choice, or the stark choice, I should say, that I think Africa has to make between three things. One is trying to do it on its own, and eventually it should. Of course it should, and maybe the diaspora will lead to that. And continuing with external funding, and then managing, hopefully, the content of education in such a way that it is not politicized. The third choice, unfortunately, is made by a third party, and I can see when China built its train line directly from somewhere to Lhasa, my quipping was, then it's from Lhasa to Lagos. And I surmise that China does not have intentions that are exactly pure in Africa. It's fairly evident that what they're looking for is opportunity to exploit resources, and so if we play down the possible mitigating influence of Western foundations, certainly, which would claim to be more neutral than direct governments, then it's something to consider, yes.
It is a challenging one, but I agree with the sentiments that you are expressing, that at what point will Africa be able to do it by itself or so, and not having the third party that comes with our own agenda. So there are lots of us who are questioning whether China is the new colonial master and how will it be different? Will we have learned from the others or past experiences that will be able to be partners rather than be the colonized once more? And I'm not sure. I am one of those that are very skeptical in looking at what is happening in terms of our relationship with China and China's development agenda for Africa. So that's a big challenge. We're sitting there waiting to see what's going to be happening. But I think if we open up the space, particularly in the higher education arena, to produce the kind of knowledge that would inform and enlighten people about those kind of dangers too, will be something that will be helpful, because you cannot argue that point without really showing information and data that will be convincing enough for them to be much more careful.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. Have you been waiting? Okay, thanks.
My question's a bit more practical, but I was just wondering, so you were saying that initially a lot of, these foundations have a lot more control because, they, universities might have to compromise their priorities. And I'm just wondering, after, university receives the money, how much control does the organization still, or the foundation still have?
I think I'll answer it first on a lighter note. Once the money has been given, it's given with conditions, or one would say conditionalities. It's money from the World Bank and all that. But at the same time, I think there's still a little bit of room for wiggle, also, as long as you report along the lines that the foundation expects you to report. And I'll give you a lighter example of that. I've mentioned this one several times. One of the things that I've really found amusing, and that African exceptionalism is grantee exceptionalism in this case, where you go to the functions that are hosted by the same foundations, and they would serve you liquor. But when they give you money as a grantee, they tell you cannot use that money for alcohol. So, but there are many ways of doing your books where you declare your alcohol to be water, and you drink a lot of water, so the bill is higher. So there's a little bit of wiggle room in some ways, but not much, because the reporting mechanisms are such that you have to report exactly on those. And there's always the overseeing where the program officers are always hovering around you, coming to look and see what's going on or so. So that limits some of the things that you are capable of doing.
I'm more concerned about what happens when the grant is spent and the foundation ceases to be interested. And there's an old saying that goes like this: is when the government comes in, the foundations goes out, and I think that's worrisome for Africa, because I don't think the governments will come in and replace the funding. So. Yeah, I don't want to leave on a negative note, but I just hope that more funders, maybe from the diaspora and other places, come in and support this field.
But I also want to comment on this whole thing that when foundations come in, the government leaves. I think with the data that you have shown, foundations have spent a lot of money in Africa to date, but with the trends observed in terms of what's happening with higher education in Africa, African governments are spending more money on higher education compared with what they have done in the past. And there's data that shows that between 2000 and 2003, something like 25 of the countries has expanded their support for higher education, the percentage of the GDP that they're spending on education, and the percentage of the budget that goes into education has increased. I don't have sort of like the specificity of that as to whether some of those countries are the countries that are getting more money or whether it's the other countries that are not getting more money. But there is interest in the government in spending more money on education despite money that's coming from the foundations too.
And that's a positive note for us to maybe move into our reception. We have some space for these conversations to continue, for you to be able to ask more questions. And I've been told that we're serving water. No, there will actually also be wine, but we're just going to tell everybody that it's water. So thank you so much again to Fabrice Jaumont and Teboho Moja for joining us this evening, and for all of you, and for Albertine Books for having us here in this space. So thank you for coming.